Bracaglia. Did I say that last name right? I did it. I did it right. So Giorgio and I have known each other for a long time. Giorgio heads up the Holy Shroud Guild, which the Holy Shroud Guild has been around for a long time, but he is doing a very important archiving of all of the Holy Shroud Guild documents that have been in the art. And he'll tell you all about that. How many pages of archives are there? I mean.
It's a lot. I've scanned probably right now close to 20,000, and I'm probably
20,000 pages he's scanned, and you're not even close to being done.
Oh no, I probably got another 2 years.
Is yours on?
I'm not on unless there's. Wade.
Here, let's press this button and hope it doesn't explode.
No, it's closer. Oh yeah, there you go. Thank you.
Hang on to that. Okay, and these are your cameras?
Those are my cameras, yes, okay. Thank you.
So,
it's for my daughter.
Okay.
She wants to laugh at me, so, you know.
Okay. Go, please.
Oh, sorry. Nope, that's just me messing up with the project. Big title, big words. I'll explain it. All it means, there's two ecclesiastical main figures in the Holy Shroud Guild. That was Father Rinaldi and Father Otterbaum. Father Otterbaum was the president of the guild. Father Rinaldi, who was born in Loo, and that's in the foothills of the Alps in Piedmont, in the province. He was our vice president of the guild, and very instrumental because being born in Italy, he was very well respected in Italy, in Turin. Now, this presentation is really going to just kind of bring up the importance of interdependence between international collaborations with Turin. Because the most successful accomplishment of the Guild was to bring in a group of American scientists in 1978 during the Ostensione, the extension, where they were able to examine it. And it's a remarkable feat that Father Rinaldi was able to do, to have Americans involved with Shroud studies. However, it didn't take long. There was definitely a lack of communication, a lack of understanding of roles, and the deterioration started to occur between American scientists, the ecclesiastical authorities in Turin, and even scientists in Italy, inside the International Center of Syndenology, which is Turin's main group of scientists for the studies of the Shroud of Turin. I went through that. Okay. I'm going to take an event, and this one event is of many. And what it demonstrates is that the collapse of an interpersonal structure or dependence of the communication, of the lack of communication, the lack of leadership, to see that this project managed was done correctly. And it was introduced, Ian Wilson was the first one to introduce Dr. Macron. Now, Dr. Macron was performing what he called a non-destructive way of testing the shroud. And what he was proposing was called nuclear, let me see, that was a nuclear emulsion. It's a technique that would be using a lot less material to date the shroud. So Wilson was excited because Dr. Macron agreed on working with him on the shroud. So Wilson contacted the Holy Shroud Guild to help him write up a proposal in Italian, and of course the Holy Shroud Guild would be happy to finance the project as well, And so Wilson decided what he would do is write to King Umberto, who was the Shroud. He had the possession of the Shroud in a sense that he was the owner. He also wrote to Pope Paul VI, and a letter was also written to the Archbishop of Turin, who is responsible of the Shroud of Turin, and his was Michele Pellegrino. However, 2 years went by and there was no answer. So in 1976, Ian Wilson decided to come up with what he coined an action plan. And the plan this time involved Archbishop Bruno Heim. Now, he was the first apostolic nuncio in Britain. And that was very important. And he drafted the letter, which he sent to the Archbishop, again, Michele Pellegrini, and also who was going to be accompanying them was Dr. Willis. Now, Dr. Willis was the most famous England's leading Zindanologist of its time, and he was extremely respected in Turin. Unfortunately, Dr. Willis passed away, so that plan never materialized. Did I do something? Well, okay. Well, time went by and a new generation was introduced. And a lot of this had to do with the ecumenical movement, which the Shroud was an excellent tool to bring all Christian faiths together and study. And one of the younger individuals and very active in Shroud studies was a Reverend David Sachs, and he was an American Episcopal preacher who worked in London in the American school. Now, Sachs was able to arrange a private meeting with Dr. McCrone and Professor Reyes. Now, Professor Reyes was the one that was given samples from the lower end of the Shroud at the lower portion, and I believe it would be on the first print there to the lower left. Now, what they were trying to do was, Sachs was informing Professor Reyes about this new technology of Dr. McCrone, and he wanted to get those samples so he can test them for carbon-14. But prior to the meeting, Reyes had no idea what carbon-14 was as far as what the process was requiring, how much material was needed, so he contacted the Louvain University to Professor Appert and Gillot. Reyes also contacted, and this is important, Reyes also contacted Dr. Corto of the Museum of the Egyptology in Turin, who was also involved in the 1973 Commission of Shroud Studies, and Monsignor Caramello, who was responsible for all the inventory taken from the 1973 commission of all the threads. And he had to contact them because to release these threads, they needed permission from the king and from the archbishop. Now, David Rolfe, Sachs, Ian Wilson always corresponded with the Guild in any measure or anything that's dealing with the Shroud. They always had an open communication, which was very good. David Rolfe writes a letter explaining the Reyes and McCrone's meeting. Now, David Rolfe, I don't know if you're familiar with him, he is the director of the Silent Witness, which is being televised, I believe, in the afternoons here, so you can get to see it. The Guild basically was the producers. They were the ones that provided the funds. Now, Rinaldi receives this letter, And he immediately responds back to Sachs. And what he says to Sachs is, whoa, you can't just get and release this. Because you have to understand, during the 1969-73 commission, there was an agreement that any threads that was removed from the shroud has to be returned to the king, which there was, or it can also be read to Turin. So it would go back, but it would go back to either Turin or to the king. However, Rinaldi was still excited about one thing, the Louvain University, which is a prestigious Catholic school in Belgium, that they were involved, because they may have the influence to convince the Archbishop of Turin to have those threads, those samples, tested for carbon-14. Also what came out was the commission report. Now, the commission report detailed the exact location of raised threads, how much of raised threads was removed, and it was determined that there would be enough threads to do the carbon-14. So Macron decided to write directly back to the Louvain University, to Professor Appert, to explain that there's now new technology that is able to sample the amount of threads or amount of samples of the shroud that they can do the carbon-14 testing successfully. However, in a letter from who was the Center International of Zindanology at the time was Piero Correro, which is Rinaldi informally like to call him Don Correro, which is a very honored, prestigious way of, it shows a great deal of affection. But he writes to Rinaldi and tells him that all the samples are now returned to Turin. We're presuming also the Louvain as well, that the samples that were held at the Louvain University. So, a few months go by, and we had to wait till the Albuquerque proceeding, which was sponsored by the Holy Shroud Guild. This was starting to organize the American scientists that there's a possibility that during the 1978 ostension that they'll be able to do an examination. And in there, a gentleman who is now the center of the Roman Zindanology, Monsignor Ricci. Now, Monsignor Ricci was very excited about this prospect of the carbon-14, and he was going to help Dr. Macron kind of procure samples of linen with known dates. And he committed to get the Antino linen, which has a known date, so he would be able to do a dry run. However, the Secretary General and the assistant of Monsignor Ricci, a woman by the name of Mary Elizabeth Patrizzi, actually said that she can probably obtain and procure the Sudarium cloth for the dry run testing. Now, this wasn't announced inside the Albuquerque workbook sheet. This was a private conversation they had between the whole group. And she was able to procure 2 samples. And what Macron wanted to do was to bring those samples to the 2 techniques of carbon dating, which was the gas portional counter and the accelerator mass spectrometer. So he had enough samples to do a dry run and test both methods. A few months go by. It was in September. Rinaldi was able to set up a meeting with the General Committee. The General Committee is mostly groups from the International Center of this Zindanology and other members of the science, normally in the laity group. And the idea of this committee was to hear the proposal of the American scientists. When they heard the proposal, they were extremely excited. And it was pretty much a go as long as the Archbishop agreed upon for the examination. Now, it was also established, and this is important, it was also established at the time that it would be the committee, which would be the center, and the international, that the Italian scientists would be the only ones as the advisory role to the Archbishop. And that meant they would be doing all the consulting, the direct consulting with no other interference, which the Archbishop will then consult with His Majesty to seek the permission to test these threads, because they needed both permission. However, Monsignor Ricci already arranged a secret meeting with the king. Now, consider the fact in Albuquerque, they kind of agreed on being proactive. So you can see, he already has to keep quiet with what the agreement was with the committee, saying that they would be the only ones that would be discussing the matter with the Archbishop directly, which he would be the only one discussing it with the king. Unfortunately, Ricci already had an agreement, and he was told that he had to keep this confidential. Well, a few days later, Audubon, after the meeting in Turin, Audubon went to England to discuss with David Rolfe how things are doing with the movie Silent Witness. And it was there is when he learned about this secret meeting. Now, why was it okay to give Audubon the news? Was the king said to them that it's fine, you can discuss it openly now? I don't know. I have not found any records to determine what happened. But Audubon informed Rinaldi. Meanwhile, Macron's back in Chicago. He's excited that the news is now open, because Macron was working on a manuscript called the Microanalytical, and that was documenting all the work he was doing on the Sudarium, setting up the procedure to have that carbon dated. That's part of the book. That's actually an image of a sample of the Sudarium cloth. And that's his cover, which I do have the book, and I'll probably bring it in the back, so if you guys want to look at it later, you're welcome. He distributed that book to the center, to even some of the American scientists. Dr. Jackson received it, Dr. Jumper, of course, Audubon, Rinaldi received it, and Professor Bologna received it. So now everybody understands that Dr. Macron is ready to do this dry run. As a matter of fact, that's the tube with the gas ready to be carbon dated. So it's already prepared. Now, there was a repercussion, because once Rinaldi found out, he immediately scolded Ricci for working independently, because he wanted to make sure that the guild was distant from what happened, from what has just occurred. So he scolded him, and he was worried that once this gets, once the authorities find out, he was worried if it was going to affect the 1978 examination. Would this delay the procedures? So, with his concern, he consulted with Don Corriero, and Corriero suggested to Rinaldi, listen, why don't you write the Archbishop, and that was a gentleman by the name of Ballestero, Cardinal Ballestero. Write him a letter, explain the circumstances, have Ricci write Caramello a letter and Ballestero explaining the circumstances, and hopefully that would settle the matter. However, they were very satisfied with Ricci's response, and yes, it settled the matter as far as Ricci was concerned. But Rinaldi was really upset with Macron, because Macron distributed this microanalytical manuscript. And he felt that that was a breach of secrecy that he gave his word to the king, as well as the Archbishop de Oviedo, who actually also gave the samples of the Sudarium. This misfortune permanently damaged Macron as far as the eyes of the guild. However, there was another incident that occurred. But because regardless of this incident, Macron was already removed from any carbon dating procedures. Reason? Because at the same time, Turin was still talking to other universities and other professionals in the field. And they realized Dr. Macron really did not have the expertise. So Turin was already distancing themselves with Dr. Macron. However, the guild never told Dr. Macron. So right up to the 1978 extension, he worked on it right up till the end of the summer. Now, what does this event explain? Well, we can see that the Guild's greatest accomplishment was to secure funding for the silent witness. The funding came from a foundation called Durance. Now, what did the funding do for with the movie for the silent witness? The profits of that movie was able to provide funding for the American group of scientists to go to Turin. Now, let me give you a little detail who the Durance Foundation is. Durance Foundation Corporation was formed in the early 50s by Harry John. Now, Harry John was a grandson of the Miller Brewery dynasty. And until 1992, they were the largest Catholic charity until his death, and it was dissolved. Now, fear of losing control. See, the Guild has been working with the Shroud from 1951. They were very upset during the 1973 commission that they were kind of kept out of it. And they wanted to make sure that this time they would be able to lead into a scientific study. But they were feeling they were losing control because Reverend Sachs was pursuing carbon dating, Macron meeting with Rays. All this was done which they felt was done behind the back. But there really was an open dialogue. It's just that the expectation would be that they would always be notified before any of this type of activity would occur. After the Albuquerque proceeding, Ritchie starts working independently. They now had secured 2 samples of the Sudarium. And of course, a secret meeting with the king. Well, Ritchie working independently, I would say would be a little bit unfair because again, in the Albuquerque proceeding, it was announced that he would be trying to obtain samples for Dr. Macron. Procuring the 2 samples of the Sudarium was openly discussed. The secret meeting with the king in Geneva, well, the king outranks all of them, so I guess they felt obligated that that had to be kept a secret. And Rinaldi retaliates. He informs Turin, of course, of Ritchie's action. He asks Ritchie to write a letter to apologize. And Rinaldi also informs the Johns of the Durance Corporation. See, he informs the Durance Corporation because Ritchie was also very important to getting funding for the movie because he was a consultant to the silent witness. Again, the Guild felt they were losing control. Father Rinaldi really wanted to have more say in the content of the movie. but the Johns knew Monsignor Ricci, and they were very confident of his knowledge of the Shroud. So a lot of the inside arguments and inside kind of pull of power is being hidden between receiving funding for this movie. Now, in the final analysis, being relevant seemed to be the most important objective for every group. And not only was the Guild guilty of this, but it really was like an infection, because it turned out that every group really wanted to be the sole leaders. And regardless, there was only going to be one winner. Because if you think about it, the intent was always clear. The committee was the center of the International of Syndenology in Turin. They were the ones that gave permission to the Americans to come into Turin to examine the Shroud, only on the respect of Father Rinaldi as being one involved in the ecclesiastical authorities. So it's the failure of project managing by the Guild in this particular case, and there's countless of others where blames will be associated with many groups. But when you project manage this kind of an operation, it was flawless, the American scientists, what they did. Their performance was absolutely flawless, so quality, in time. You can't criticize that. But the most important thing that the Guild led that they failed, and that was taking a hold and understanding the stakeholders. And without understanding the stakeholders that were involved, and you're dealing with many, this interdependence broke. The synergy of working together broke. And this is important for future American participation and any European participation to work together, is to really understand, to set up the next time a project of any of this type occurs, stakeholder has to be the primary concern. Not quality, which I would have always said quality, but under this circumstances, there's no doubt stakeholders. And now actually, if anybody asks me as a project manager, I would say stakeholders, based on all this information that I'm reading on the Shroud, on the Guild's archivals, because it's a history of this dating back from 1949. And there was any questions? Thank you. Good, you get the photos? Well, thank you.